Right, well, everybody who wishes to be seated, please be seated. I'm Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director General here at RUSI. Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to have Mike Pompeo speaking with us today. The focus is going to be on Ukraine, but of course Ukraine is such an important focus of deliberation at this institute and in the international security community that inevitably I think will touch on quite a number of related issues. And I'm especially delighted that this event has been sponsored by Kyivstar. Mr. Pompeo is, I believe, a non-executive director of Kyivstar, and we no doubt we'll talk about some of the issues in relation to Ukrainian infrastructure as this event goes ahead. The event is entirely on the record, so our conversation with which we are going to start is on the record. There will then be plenty of opportunity for Q&A, so do please store up your questions for Mr. Pompeo as we go through the conversation phase. I would be obliged if everybody would turn their phones onto silent, since there's nothing worse than your own idiosyncratic ringtones being transmitted to all your friends.
Worse things.
There are worse things, but this is pretty bad. There are quite a number of members of the media here as well, and I'm sure we'll get lots of opportunities for them to ask questions, but I'll try and get a balance between members of the media and other people here because we've got a lot of expertise in the room. I think one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to this discussion is because Mike has really had a lot of experience in American politics, in the political reality of intelligence and foreign policy. Experience both in the House of Representatives, where he served for the state of Kansas, but also in two of the most senior security positions in the US government as CIA director and then Secretary of State. And what I wanted to start with, if I may, is talk a little bit about the relationship between politics, especially American politics, and international security. One of the things we were just remarking on before we came in here is how surprising democratic politics is. We've just seen in the last weeks a whole succession of democratic surprises, at least to me. Others may have been better in their predictive powers than I was. We saw the world's largest democracy having that massive election, which came up with a result which none of the pundits suggested would be likely when Mr. Modi, the BJP, lost its majority in the Indian parliament. We saw the ANC, which has been in power in South Africa since 1994, pretty decisively losing its majority in South Africa. We saw a general election called in this country by a prime minister who's 20 points behind in the polls, and nobody, I think, really expected, not many people expected Rishi Sunak to call an election here. And for me, at least, also pretty dramatically, just last night, we saw a general election called to the French Parliament by President Macron after those European Parliament elections. So the three most important military actors in NATO are all going to have general elections in the space of a few months of each other, along with the world's largest democracy. And it may be a source of strength to democracies, but it's certainly a source of interest and sometimes bewilderment. So maybe I could start with that in context, Mike, by going back specifically in the issue of Ukraine, and to get some of your reflections looking back in the periods, really since you were in the House, and I think you were also in the House Intelligence Committee. In your period in the House, which was mainly before the first invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. In that period, how big an issue was Ukraine when American politicians were looking at the world, and how big a shock were the events in 2014?
Oh, goodness. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me here. It's wonderful to be back here and be with you all as well. I remember what I remember about Ukraine really was two things from those times. So I came on the House Intelligence Committee. It would have been in very beginning of 2013. At the top of the list from a national security perspective was the challenges in the Middle East. ISIS was beginning to build. The terrorism threat was still very real in the region, and we were having a handful of sporadic issues inside the United States as well, domestic foreign terror coming to the homeland. That would have been, if the American people were thinking about priorities in that time, that certainly would have been, it would not have been Russia. But of course, we knew the history too with Russia, right? Not the first, Crimea wasn't their first rodeo. The first one you could describe differently, but Georgia for sure, before that. And then I remember, and I must have been 14 when I went to the Munich Security Conference with Senator Graham and Senator McCain, and we were talking to Secretary Kerry, trying to convince Secretary Kerry to provide defensive weapon systems to the Ukrainians even then, so always in February, probably 14, and they just steadfastly, he and President Obama just steadfastly refused to do so. We could see that the conflict, the risk was accumulating. But they chose not to do that. And then the annexation, probably a bit of a surprise. The intelligence community knew that there was this risk for sure, but the manner and methodology by which it was pulled out, and frankly, the relative ease with which a fifth of a country was taken, I think was a bit surprising to most of the Western analytical community. And then in response to that, the West does almost nothing. Kind of just sits back on a hunch. There's still no defensive weapon systems provided to Ukraine, even post that in the Obama administration. Still relatively low on America's agenda. I became the CIA director. I spent a fair amount of time in the Donbass, in the southeast part of Ukraine, as the CIA director, along with UK and European intelligence folks. There was the artillery being exchanged there. I mean, the conflict was on. It was a hot conflict even then for sure. And we were training Ukrainian special operators, Ukrainian special forces, and we were building a consensus in Congress, doing our best to build a consensus in Congress and to convince President Trump to provide weapons to Ukraine, and we ultimately did. Were able to make the case and provide, frankly, the very missile systems that saved Kyiv in February of 22 were provided probably too late and probably too small, but sufficient at least for that moment. And now it's a hotly contentious issue in domestic politics, not just in the United States, but all across the country. And by the way, it's not divides by left and right. There's big fights inside of my party, the Republican Party, and big fights inside the Democrat Party too. And then I guess I'll end with the American people are deeply aware of this. They saw this play out on their television screens. They saw the death and destruction. They're looking for someone to articulate a vision for victory. And if you ask me, President Biden, my good friend Secretary General Stoltenberg, have been just a little too willing to pat themselves on the back and claim, boy, what a success. We united NATO. I don't think if you're a Ukrainian mother, you feel very good about that. Right? Sort of the one bite at the apple theory, or how about now 2 years and 6 months bites at the apple. We fundamentally have failed the test of deterrence and continue to fail it every single day. And so someone needs to articulate a vision for how it is we restore the very deterrence that was lost in February of 22. Why it didn't happen for 4 years, right? You have to just think your way through. Why does Putin, who I think we would all agree has in his DNA the desire to reunite the Soviet Union, right, to create greater Russia, describe it however one will as a historic matter. But this is very much who he is and his goal. Why did he take a fifth of it, stop for 4 years, and then go back at it? I think it is a very reasonable question to ask, and why does he continue to do it today? And the simple answer, the Ronald Reagan 101 answer, would be the benefit exceeds the cost. Nobody has articulated a set of costs to Vladimir Putin who will cause him to step away from the continued aggression in Europe. And this is the risk. The risk is if we continue to be on our back foot, and it takes us 2 years to say, you can use a US-provided weapon system 6 meters across an artificial boundary, right? 2 years. I promise you, Vladimir Putin and I fear Chairman Kim, Xi Jinping are watching this too, and they can see a West that hasn't figured out that it is in fact a we win, we lose proposition in these things, and instead is playing out this devastatingly bad for Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, for Europe, and for the United States of America, this devastatingly bad stalemate we've seen for 2.5 years now.
So I think in what you're saying, you're suggesting that during the period when you were in office, during the Trump presidency, the US was successful in deterring Russia from a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Is that right?
Well, it's just true.
So what?
I mean, I'm not suggesting anything.
Okay, but
as a historical matter, Your Honor, allow the record to reflect.
Sure.
We didn't take an inch of Ukraine for 4 years.
Absolutely.
Now everybody can decide why.
So what? Just talk us through what measures.
We provided defensive weapons. First of all, we had Donald Trump.
Right.
Right. I had a great boss. As a Secretary of State, what you need is a boss that people go, I don't exactly know how he's going to respond to that. And Pompeo is a son of a bitch, right? We don't know what the boss is going to do, but we know what Mike thinks. And who knows how much power he has inside. And so, right, deterrence is in the mind of the putative aggressor. So it's not only the things that you do, but it's the perception of risk that you create in the minds of the decision makers of your adversaries. I'm pretty convinced that the things we did convinced him, it's just not worth the candle. Whether it was a set of sanctions we put in place, whether it was the fact that we were producing American energy and his wealth-generating machine wasn't what it is today. Think about that. The Russian economy grew faster than the American economy last year. Just let that settle in for you for a minute. The powerful Western sanctions, so vaunted, so feared, that Secretary Blinken said, just give us a little time. It takes a little time for sanctions to take effect. He was suggesting months. We're now in years. And we all know these are epic failures. If the goal is to achieve a prohibitive punishment on the Russian economy, this isn't political. This is just data. I think Vladimir Putin understood that the risk was too great for 4 years. And, I always, as a Christian, the good Lord was with us too, so I'll credit him first. But second, I'll credit a set of policies, a set of understandings in the world that we were serious about defending the red lines that we drew. And the last that there's some red lines we didn't draw. And we didn't draw them with great intention because we knew we weren't prepared to actually defend them. And so we were very careful about saying, here are the things that we will do. And then we were very quiet about the things that we wouldn't do. But I think folks came to appreciate that if they say they're going to defend this, they'll actually do it. And we did. A massive strike into Syria, right? President Obama says, if they use chemical weapons, I'm going to. He does not. He whiffs, right? Green light for the bad guys. President Trump said, if you guys use chemical weapons, we fired, I don't even remember, like the entire arsenal of our missiles one night. We shot all the fireworks. The whole world took note of that. You could, by the way, I was an intelligence guy at the time. The whole world noted, oh my gosh, he said he would do X. If we did Y, they did Y, and we did X. We'd be good to build up a track record of actually doing that. And I think that's where the West finds itself now, is that no one finds our assertions about the activities we undertake remotely reliable. And that goes for our friends and our adversaries.
So an important part of deterrence is showing a willingness to use the measures that you're threatening, as you said. An important part of deterrence is also clear messaging, so the potential opponent understands what you're saying. How far during that period you were in office were you conscious of sending messages, being a CIA director, but also as Secretary of State, sending those messages to Vladimir Putin?
We're pretty clear, but we were pretty good about doing it privately. I was chuckled if anybody was watching when you said this is on the record. I consider everything I say in the entire world on the record. More than 2 people, it's a public meeting. That was even true at a skiff at the State Department. We were pretty clear about, and by the way, I do want to say, this wasn't bluster. This wasn't that we were the meanest kids on the block. There were a handful of things that we let go, right? We would say, oh, it's inside the line. We're not prepared to put America's kids or America's weapons or America's arsenal behind that. And so we would just be quiet. But we spent very little time publicly talking about the things we wouldn't do. Right. And that's one of the great failures of the last 2.5 years is we spent an awful lot of time telling the Russians, here's the things we're not going to do. Putin never says what he's not going to do. Go find a time that Vladimir Putin said, oh, I won't do that. He'll say things that he may or may not actually intend. He'll bluster, or he'll bluff, or he'll test, or he'll probe. But he never goes out and says, I won't do it. West spends a lot of time trying to calm the nerves of everyone around the world, saying, no, I'm not crazy. I won't do that. And it's always just, it's counterproductive. Privately, lots of different conversations. And we had them. We had them with the Iranians as well. We had them with Chairman Kim in North Korea. We had a big public summit, but we had very private conversations as well. We were pretty clear when we built out the campaign to stop the ISIS folks from beheading people, which was the primary threat that was in front of me when I became the CIA director, and when General Mattis was the Secretary of Defense. That was the task of the First Order. We had lots of conversations that were very private about here's the lengths with which we're prepared to go. Very important. By the way, I hope some of those are happening today. I hope we're telling Putin the things that we're prepared to do, and I simply don't know about it.
Of course,
yeah.
Of course. No,
which could be.
Very good. So can I turn to the remarks you made about the debates within the US Congress, because here in the UK and I think in other European countries, quite a lot of worry about that quite long period of time when provision of further military aid to Ukraine was held up in a Congress. I'm not sure I entirely understand what that was all about. Yeah. So give me your take on that.
Oh, goodness. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince everyone along the full political spectrum, although I probably spent more time talking to folks from inside of my party, trying to convince them of why it mattered to America, to make the America First case, which was the central theme of our 4 years. And I was met with some very reasonable responses. Some of them weren't. Some of them were just, they were afraid to go home to their own district and explain why this mattered. And I get that, by the way. European parliamentarians are the worst at this. But please take no offense. But I will say, the good news is I'm an unemployed former diplomat, so I can say exactly what I believe. European parliamentarians are terrible about going back home and explaining why things matter, why you should spend 2% of GDP to defend. Like 2%, like come on. Like these should be easy lip, and yet they just don't want to do it because everybody wants bridges and food and welfare, right? It's a much harder case to go make that says, no, this is what we should do to make sure that your grandchildren get to live with basic human dignity and property rights. It's a much harder argument, especially for a legislator who's not in the national security world. That's true in the United States as well. Some of them just didn't want to go home and make the case. Second thing is, I talked about this, it was very difficult for them to tell me why they thought President Biden thought this mattered. For 2 years, he'd never spoken to the American people, right? Typically, when the United States engages in an effort where we spend this much American wealth, the president will go to the White House at 9 p.m. Eastern and give a speech and articulate the vision. He never did it. He can defend the choice he made, but he never laid out the case for the American people, nor did he lay out the case, nor has he today laid out a case for what victory looks like. And they'd say to me, Mike, I'm happy, whatever, $60 billion, no sweat. But what are we going to do with it? We won't, at this point, we won't even, if the Russians mass 3 divisions on the other side of the border, we can't touch them with these weapons. That's a pretty good argument. I would just have to go, yeah, it's pretty reasonable. You should vote no. Right? I mean, it's not what I would say, but these are the policy increments that have failed, and it's why it took us so long to generate what, in my judgment, is deeply the right outcome for the United States. A successful victory for Europe is an absolute global imperative, and that includes an imperative for people in my home state of Kansas.
So you talk quite a bit there about theory of victory, would be the term many people use. Do you think the Ukrainian government has a clear theory of victory?
I do. It may not be achievable. I mean, we know what their stated objective is. It's a pretty darn reasonable objective. I'd like my country back. It seems pretty simple. I'd like parts of Arizona and Texas back too. We're trying to get it in America. We have a full-on invasion in the United States of America as well. It's not kinetic in this same way, but it's killing an awful lot of Americans. I would also be reminded of this with great frequency by American elected officials. Mike, we can't keep millions of people from pouring across our border. Goodness gracious, what the hell are we going to do in Europe? And so, by the way, it is a very reasonable argument. I would counter, America's entirely capable of doing each. We just simply have an administration that's chosen to do neither today. So I think we should do both of them. Yes, I think the Ukrainians understand. I also think they know what a reach that is, how difficult that's going to be. They are not naive about the defensive barriers that have been built, the full mass of the Russian economic might. So I think they're pretty realistic. But yes, I think they know what victory looks like, and I must say it's pretty remarkable. They haven't asked any of us to send a single one of our boys or girls. They've just said, be the arsenal for our democracy. And that's a pretty small ask in my judgment.
But our theory of victory, the British or American theory of victory, is not the same as the Ukrainian one.
I don't know. It's hard to know. I don't know what the American theory is. I don't know what the administration's theory of victory is today. I couldn't speak to it.
Should our theory?
Yes, our theory should be precisely the same. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Absolutely. Full-throatedly. Yeah. Again, we had theories of victory in Vietnam. We didn't get them all. It's not that this is tangible or achievable, but we shouldn't shy away from knowing what that looks like. There are also interim achievements that can actually be garnered. You can get to a resolution that begins to grind your way back and claw your way back. And it's, by the way, we always focus on the kinetic piece of this. This is a political fight as well. And the Russians are fighting this political fight in media, in cyberspace. We shouldn't just focus on how many, my armor officer, always sign me up for more tanks, right? But it's not just about tanks and artillery. This is about what's this border of Europe and Russia going to look like for the next 75 years. And we need to be ever mindful that this is not just going to be a Ukrainian challenge. This is a European challenge, and therefore a challenge that the United States needs to be all in on.
One of the challenges which Kyivstar has been facing, and many Ukrainian companies and indeed the Ukrainian government have been facing, especially over the last 6 months, is the war of attrition Russia is waging against Ukraine's infrastructure, and the challenges of rapidly reconstructing facilities that have been damaged. And that speaks to the broader question, which you already hinted at, that in many ways this has turned into a war of attrition, which is about resources, about ability to reconstitute, ability to mobilize. And of course, because Western countries are not engaging directly but only indirectly in this conflict, that poses real challenges for a country which is only a fraction of the size of Russia. And Russia, of course, gets support from others as well. Are you optimistic that Ukraine can, in the end, triumph in a war of attrition, or does there have to be another way out?
Yes, I think in the end, I'm long on the Western idea. And I think the Western idea will prevail here as well. You know, I have so admired the Kyivstar team. They have their towers get knocked down, they put them back up. The infrastructure gets attacked with a massive cyber attack, and they rebuilt. These are tough people and serious people, and people who are intent on continuing to reinvest inside their own country and understand the commercial imperative, because this really gets to the core of the question is, what does this look like 2 years, 5 years, 20 years from now? There won't be British taxpayers underwriting Kyiv 20 years from now, or American taxpayers underwriting it 20 years from now. I can't tell you where the line wanders, but in the end, this will be driven by risk-taking innovators and private sector actors who feel like they can invest in Ukraine. That requires the Ukrainian government to get its act together. Court system, civil rule, property rights, all the things that encourage investment. But then the world's got to come underwrite the reconstruction of Ukraine. And there'll be enormous economic opportunities. We think Kyivstar will be a beneficiary of those. And so we have been among Kyivstar's owned by a company called Vion that trades on NASDAQ. So it owns other telecom businesses as well, but it's a US-based headquarters. And as a US-based headquarters, I think it's the largest investor in Ukraine. And we have been encouraging others to come alongside, that there is a return profile that works there, even in a time of conflict. Some of you have been to Kyiv. The city looks pretty happening to me as I drive through it. I've been there half a dozen times, perhaps, in the last 3 years or so. But the sirens go off too, and so there is real risk. But I'm convinced that there will be enormous economic opportunity, and I pray that the flip side of this, the security side of this, is the thing that will help Ukraine win this battle is their capacity to innovate. And that's what I've certainly seen at Kyivstar, its ability to reconstitute power, preserve power, because that network, as the largest telecom provider in Ukraine, that network is vital not only to the citizens of Ukraine to keep in touch with their family members and their friends across the country, but vital for the security apparatus as well. That is, it provides a significant piece of the infrastructure and architecture for all of the comms inside of the country. And they've proven to be very innovative and very resilient, and I've seen that in Ukrainian weapons manufacturing. I've seen it in the capacity for the Ukrainian power plants to bring themselves back online when that infrastructure has been attacked. I've seen it in the medical system, in their capacity to serve and treat the wounded veterans who are coming back from the front lines as well. They have demonstrated in the face of a massive attack by a very big country their capacity to withstand the assault and to come out on the other side more innovative and more creative. You beat mass with innovation, and I'm convinced the Ukrainians can achieve that.
Very good. Let's turn to questions from the floor then. And if you could indicate by raising your hand, there should be a microphone. There are a couple of microphones, so please wait until the microphone arrives before asking your question, and please introduce yourselves. So I think we have James Langdale here, please.
Good morning, James Landau.
James, stand up,
I'll stand up.
if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, James Landau, BBC. Two very quick questions, please. One, is American isolationism an inevitable trend, regardless of who wins the election? And secondly, the G7 meets this week. What should they do with frozen Russian assets?
Oh, goodness. I'm not going to touch the second one because I'm the former Secretary of State and I don't want to get in their way. But I'll give you a theory on the frozen Russian assets. I'll give you a theory of the case. It seems absurd to me if your desire is to impose costs on the Russian economy to permit those to sit in limbo with at least some Russian some Russian entrepreneurs, I'm going to use that word very loosely, believing that they will get this property back when the time is right. It creates, I think, all the wrong incentives. I'm sorry, the first part of the question again? Isolation. No, it's not an inevitable trend. And frankly, I don't think America is particularly isolationist. I think the vast majority of the American people actually understand that a sovereign Europe matters deeply to the United States and prepared to do an awful lot to do what it can to make that increasingly likely. So I haven't seen a trend towards isolationism. We all know it's always been deeply part of the American tradition, right? Since that other July 4th, right? So I guess I'm in the wrong place for that. But in any event,
we forgive you.
It's also been part of my party. Right from Ross Rowe and Rand Paul and his father Ron Paul, Pat Buchanan almost knocked off George Bush Sr. on that same idea, right? This same, it's not isolation. This idea that says, we can't be all things to everywhere all the time along a continuum pretty far down. So it's always been buried in the U.S. Democratic debate. I will say what is different. I'll be as polite as I know how to be, and I'm sure you won't think I am. But the world watches, when it travels outside the United States, Americans, they watch CNN International and BBC. And I must say, if I watched either of those exclusively, I wouldn't like Donald Trump either. They carried out the Russia hoax against our administration for 2.5 years on these two international networks. They told a story that was patently false for 2.5 years, and it did enormous harm to our effort to contain this very threat in Russia. Because my boss was a Russian asset, and I'm sure those of us in the administration weren't far behind, right? We had 50 senior intelligence officers claim that a certain laptop was Russian disinformation. These are former, very senior officials. In fact, 3 former senior leaders, 2 former CIA directors and a former DNI, all of whom knew that wasn't true when they said it. I have not heard an apology from any of the 51 yet. But the American people, and frankly, the people of Europe, see that too, and they say, I wonder. It sure makes it hard. And so I actually think what's the right descriptor? This progressive bias that sits on top of the global media empire actually causes Americans to have less confidence in its own institutions and creates the very risk that I think most of the folks who are on these networks trying to tell a story to encourage, I think it actually operates just 180 degrees out and creates more risk that the West will walk away from these incredibly important tasks.
Thank you.
That's pretty polite, I think. Yeah.
That's great. Let me see now. Yeah, please, Kim.
Thanks, Malcolm. Kim Stan-Gupta, I'm a journalist with The Independent in London.
Sir.
You may have been asked this before, Mr. Pompeo. I'm sure you have. Apologies for that. But Mr. Trump, your former boss, had said repeatedly that when he gets into power, he will end the Ukraine war very quickly. I think he said within 24 hours because of his influence, his relationship with Mr. Putin. Mm-hmm. Knowing the man, how do you think he'll go about doing that? And do you think is that at all achievable from your own vast experience in these matters? Thanks.
Oh, goodness. I saw the comment on 24 hours. I follow his Twitter account closely. I looked at it every day to make sure I still had a job. My predecessor was fired via Twitter, so I always checked it and made sure I should go to work. I think the model will look relatively like it did for the time that we were there. It was a model where we sought to engage. So I engaged at CIA with Naryshkin and Bortnikov, who were some of his primary interlocutors, and Petrushev, very quietly, trying to find the boundaries, the places where we thought we could actually make a difference and have an impact and begin to shape. You'll remember, too, another message we sent that was less quiet when the Russians came across the southern Euphrates River in Syria, the Wagner forces. We killed 300 Russians. The first American at-scale attacks on Russian people in an awfully long time. I think Vladimir Putin understood that message. I was in the center of this. We warned them. They built their bridge. They came across, and we killed them. There's no chance if the Russians came across the Euphrates that President Biden would have taken that strike. I shouldn't say there's no chance. That's too Trumpian. It seems the probability is very low that they would take that strike. They just have a different way of thinking about the risk of escalation. And they talk about escalation until it's just annoying. Because when you talk about the risk of escalation, you are literally signaling fear. And you can't get deterrence when you signal fear publicly. It's not possible to achieve. And so I think if you said, what will the model be for President Trump as he attempts to get this deterrence back, it'll be one of making clear to Putin that the string has been run out, that the costs for the continuance will exceed any potential benefit that he could likely achieve. And then he will continue to push the Europeans to get serious about defending and providing for the resources to defend themselves. And he will remind them that energy policy is a central feature of that as well. And that we've all got to make sure, we included, the United States got to get this right. And I must say, another thing I stare at today that just confounds me, and to your point about in Republican politics, what's going on. President Biden says he's serious about imposing costs on the Russian energy infrastructure, and yet their margins today for Rosneft and the like are as good as they've been in an awfully long time. And the United States has now a moratorium on the export of new natural gas exports. Go figure, right? It's hard to square that circle. And I assure you the Vladimir Putin method for squaring that circle says these folks are not remotely serious. We're going to push and push, and we will eventually wear them out. And I don't think for a moment that in a new Republican administration that Putin will think he can wear out that new team, whoever President Trump brings around him.
Thank you. My colleague Jonathan in the front row.
By the way, last thing said that, it is harder to get it back once you've lost it. And deterrence is always temporary. Those are the two central features of deterrence, is you better hang on to it while you have it, and you better know that when you have it, it is not forever. I talked about the things we didn't get right too. There are many things that the Trump administration didn't accomplish. We almost lost deterrence on Iran as well. It was slipping. We had it, and then it began to slip in 2019, in September of 2019, when they fired ballistic missiles. The Iranians fired directly from Iran into Abqaiq in eastern Saudi Arabia at an Aramco facility, and we were just blessed that there wasn't an American killed that day. And we were losing deterrence, and so we had to go restore it. And in the end, we did. And we did it with a strike on General Soleimani, the #2 Iranian official. And again, this is to President Trump's credit, the whole world took note that we had messaged them saying, if you do X and Y, we're going to do this. They did that. And then we responded, and our Department of Defense, along with our Israeli counterparts, executed remarkably, and we restored deterrence for at least a bit there. Same thing will have to be true with Russia. By the way, not only, I'm certainly worried about the continued conflict in Ukraine, but I watch what's going on in the Baltics, I watch Belarus, I watch the Moldovan government trying to figure it. I mean, it's easy to focus on the current battlefronts. We shouldn't forget that this is a wide theater of risk, and that the Chinese and the Iranians are full-throatedly in support of this Russian effort as well. These aren't separate conflicts as between Iran and China and Russia. This is team darkness and team human dignity, and we are in a struggle, and we have to prevail.
Thank you. Jonathan, could you stand?
Jonathan Howell from the Institute. You've very sort of comprehensively described the divisions inside the Republican Party in the debate about the presidential package of aid to Ukraine. But one element you didn't mention, which comes across in Europe quite frequently, is the argument that somehow this is not the war which the United States should worry about. The real challenge is China, and it is there that the American resources should be placed. And there's a sort of almost, some of the luminaries in the party argue that there's almost a trade-off between the two, that the United States can't do both, and it has to choose. Do you believe in that trade-off?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I hinted at this, but you're right. I didn't fully uncover that rock. We can absolutely do both. We have to. As to my earlier point, these are not separate conflicts. I can assure you that the people of Taiwan are desperately counting on Zelensky prevailing. Right? These are connected not only conceptually, but they're connected they all pass through this Western idea. We can absolutely do both. We are resourceful enough, wealthy enough, capable enough to achieve each of these, and we must. And so I don't buy the trade-off theory. It's true, we can't do everything always, but no one's asking for the 82nd Airborne to go both places. No one's asking for the 101st. No one's even asking for the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. These folks are just asking for the American industrial base to go build and grow and innovate, and praying that Europe will do the same. And we absolutely can achieve it. I hope Europe will do more. This is their hood, so to speak. And so it ought to take the leadership role in that responsibility. It shouldn't turn to Uncle Sam and saying, "Hey, come do this for us." But I'm convinced we can get there.
Very good. Let me just see how many people I've got. Lots of people. So there's a chap here in the middle.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Pompeo.
Could you stand
yes.
and introduce yourself? Thank you.
My name is Human. I'm a PhD researcher on financial crime with focus on Russia, China, and Iran. And I'm just wondering, the money that the Western countries are helping Ukraine is not going to help the Ukrainian people, and some of the money is getting spent in the wrong destinations. So what's your plan for that? And what about the organizations or news agencies like BBC Persian that it became propaganda for regime of Iran, as many people that they worked there, they were former commenters on Iranian TVs. And I'm just questioning, how will you deal with these two issues? Thank you.
And so I just to make sure the first question is, it's about, will resources not actually get to the places they need to go? That is, the U.S. provided resources won't get to the battlefront, won't get to the right, is that the question?
I think so,
Yeah, there's always risk of that. It happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Vietnam, it happened in World War II. It's government. Imperfect. We need to make sure it gets where it's supposed to go. My sense is, in Ukraine, the vast majority of what is being provided isn't cash transfer, it is equipment that's being delivered, and that the vast majority of that equipment is getting as quickly as we logistically can, given that this is a wartime situation, getting to where it needs to be. It should be auditable. The Ukrainian government has a responsibility to account for how it's using this. But frankly, I think we've done more harm, not with Ukrainians siphoning this money off or it wandering off, but by it got to the right place, but they couldn't use it for the proper purpose. That is, the proper military strategic objective. I think that has been the greater detriment to Ukrainian battlefield success than the risk that some of this wanders off. But I always acknowledge, some of my Republican friends say, this is a corrupt country, and this corruption, this money will go all over. Fair enough. Lots of corruption in Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. It's doing far better. It's a much better place today, and I think we collectively, NATO and the West, have done a pretty good job of making sure that the resources that have been provided have gotten to the place that it needs to go, and I'm convinced the Ukrainian government is doing everything that it can to get it there as well.
Great. Simon Gass, please.
Simon Gass, former British diplomat. Secretary Pompeo, you've said rightly, in my view, that one of the handicaps we face in Ukraine is that there is a lack of a vision for victory. There's a lack of a theory of success in Ukraine. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about what your vision of victory would be, a vision of victory which does not reward Russia for its aggression, and which does not allow Russia to pause as it did after 2014 and then roll forward again in a few years' time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think I can't tell you where the lines will be drawn. I do not know the answer to that. But here's what I know it must look like. It has to be the case that you talked about Russia feeling like it achieved a benefit, something good. I'm frankly less interested in what the Russians think about this when this is over. I'm deeply interested in what the Chinese think about it, or at least the Chinese leadership. Maybe I care what the Russian leadership thinks about it as well. And I deeply care what the European leadership and the American leadership and the rest of the world, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Singaporeans, the Australians, the South Koreans, I deeply care what they think. The world must perceive that this aggression was not rewarded, or at least rewarded in a material way, that the cost, whether there's a piece of land that one didn't get back, but that the cost for the Russian people and the Russian leadership, political leadership, exceeded the benefits to them. That must be the outcome. The second piece that you spoke to is, how do you make sure that this isn't just a pause? Well, I alluded to this earlier. It's always just a pause. It's just, I don't know what to say. It's always just a pause. It's never forever. So evil roams the earth, right? For me, I go to Genesis, right? Favorite chapter of the Bible. Evil exists. Ever vigilant. This is a constant challenge. And so, in the more tactical, you might view it as operational strategic, in the more tactical, there has to be some strategic structural security arrangement that convinces Putin or whomever his successor is, who will share Putin's vision almost certainly, that you can't go at this again. And I don't just mean Ukraine, right? I think about the political fight that's taking place in Georgia today. I watch what's happening along pieces of the Polish border, right? This has to be a continuous effort that says we're not going to permit ourselves to become as dependent on Russia as we once were, even in the aftermath, even when this is over. This can't be for the Germans a jailhouse conversion, right? Gosh, now we can go back and buy Russian gas again. It simply, this has to be a structural shift in how we view the risk of Russia for a very long glide path until something fundamentally changes there. And so that's what it looks like. And whether that's, someone asked earlier, I didn't address this, what should happen when the NATO summit takes place? I'll leave the nuance of what that should look like, but there must be a security architecture that is fundamentally different than the one that existed in September of 21. And I parked that date intentionally, not February of 2022. September 21 is when the American Intelligence Committee knew with a high degree of certainty that the Russian invasion was on. And you should note that from September of 21 to February of 22, the world did nothing. As close to nothing as one can get. Did absolutely nothing. Just stared at it and said, wow, this is going to suck. Right? That is not a security policy. That is a green light for continued aggression. We can never find ourselves in that place when there's another September of 21 where we don't have a security architecture already in place to reestablish the deterrence that had clearly been lost by then.
Great. Other questions?
And the last thing I'll say is easier said than done, for sure. I don't mean to sound like, oh my gosh, we'll figure this out. Easier said than done, but completely achievable.
Super. Isabella.
Thank you, Malcolm. So my name is Isabella Antinozzi. I'm a former RUSI researcher. Now I work as a researcher at the House of Lords. So you very rightly pointed out that Europeans should do more for their defense, and I think that's a mantra we are all very aware of. But at the same time, the US has been quite controversial about the strengthening of the EU's defense posture particularly. And some of the EU initiatives such as, PESCO or European Defense Fund were seen from the US with some nervousness, and they were labeled as protectionist. So how exactly are you going to support European defense without having to control it, really?
Yeah. Sign me up for all of those. You all want to go spend money, call it PESCO, pick whatever name you want. Build a capable set of forces. Tell your young men and women they should serve, right? Right. These are the things that nations do that are serious about protecting themselves from bad guys. I know the United States has been nervous about these things. It's always been because there was this fear somehow that these resources would be pulled from the NATO security structure, the NATO security architecture, I think. I worry about that much less. I actually think I would love to see the European defense industrial base build. Happy to have them go be wildly more successful and crush Lockheed and Boeing. Knock yourselves out. I mean that with all seriousness. Innovate, right? Inside of, whether it's inside of Airbus, inside of Leonardo, inside of BAE, wherever it is, build. Do that, innovate. Ukraine is going to be the perfect place to go innovate and train and create new technologies, ESW technology, all the signal stuff that needs to be mastered in this modern warfare and battle space. And so I don't view those, I never, even when I was in office, I always viewed those as complementary. And so I always encourage it. But it was, what happens is it is the case that the French will always borrow from Pierre to pay Paul, right? They'll say, we're going to go build out this EDF, and therefore we're going to withdraw something from someplace else. And that's just moving the chairs around, and that's not cumulative in the defense of freedom. And so sign me up for those structures just as long as they're additive, not just decorative.
I'm sure the representatives of BAE and Leonardo in the room will be pleased to hear those remarks.
Go.
Mr. Ambassador, please, front row. No, yeah, here, in the front row.
Very front.
Thank you. Edward Vasco, still the Secretary of Affairs of Ukraine in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for your extensive presentation. You have mentioned about benefits and costs. And I think there is one other element that is also essential, which is timing for benefits and costs. Because, for example,
Sure.
you will recall before 2020, there were lots of talks about banning Russia from SWIFT banking system, and it was deemed as a nuclear option. We have done that after 2022. The heavens have not collapsed. It means that we need to do this constant reassessment of what constitutes benefits and costs for the Russians. And it appears that there is always this catch-up game. Once we come up with a very decisive action, it's not so decisive anymore. So in this current situation, what is a real decisive action that can be taken here and now? Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I don't really want to talk about particular things. Everyone knows the menu. Secretary Blinken knows, everybody knows the menu. I try to stay out of it. I try to stay at a level. I don't want to get into the tactical things, but your point's very well taken. I alluded to this, right? They put sanctions in place and said, don't worry, a little bit of time, it'll work. But we know that time almost always works against sanctions, not the other way around, because the adversaries figure out how to evade them, go around to them. I also know that financial sanctions are a single tool and often don't achieve, they're much vaunted about how they'll change regimes' behavior and very seldom do. I only know one example from our time that actually worked. It worked with the Iranians. We could actually see the impact that it had on their capacity to fund their terror machine. But these were, by the way, these were massive enforced sanctions across a relatively small economy, not an economy the scale of Russian or the Chinese economy. And so we ought not think that financial tools are going to achieve those objectives. You know, I actually think one of the central features of imposing real costs on Russia will be the resurgence of the Ukrainian economy. In the end, if you really said, what does Putin really want? I want to deploy huge military forces inside of Ukraine. That's expensive, hard to do, probably unsustainable even for an economy the size of Russia's. He wants political control, right? He wants to be sitting at the desk in Kyiv instead of President Zelensky or a puppet of his. That's the place that the focus needs to be. And the Ukrainian economy, private sector reconstruction, big Western banks showing up and underwriting the Ukrainian growth model. If you said, what's the biggest cost we could impose on him? I think that would absolutely be it. And you are unlikely to achieve that without an America that is full-throatedly prepared to actually help push back from a security perspective. And that's not, I was going to use a bad word. We haven't been going at it full-throatedly yet. And we haven't let the Ukrainians actually unleash. And I'm not talking about going after the St. Petersburg and Moscow. I'm talking about structural strategic targets that are well within Ukrainians' capacity to execute, and then building up the political and economic infrastructure in Ukraine. And that really gets to the other question. If he says, what does victory look like? That's victory. And that's the thing that would preclude this happening again 2, 4, 10 years from now. But we should, by the way, never understand, we have an enormous amount of tools that we have not remotely provided to the Ukrainians to help them unleash. Intelligence tools, cyber tools, there's a lot that's in the arsenal. And because the Biden administration has just been very focused on avoiding escalation, because they want to antagonize Vladimir Putin. By the way, anybody think he's not antagonized? I suppose he could be more antagonized. It's very risky to focus all your attention on not escalating.
We have a gentleman over here.
Philippine Ambassador Teddy Locsin.
Very nice to see you again. It's been a long time.
I cast the first vote in the UN against Russia and for Ukraine. The world was never safer than when Trump and Pompeo called the shots and never gave an inch, period. Do you believe that Russian adventurism and Chinese adventurism encourage each other by feeding on the failure of a Western response? The Philippine crisis started over 20 years ago when we refused to give an inch in the West Philippine Sea, and we still refuse, though we stood alone until Trump's phone-ups, the first and the last ones in the South China Sea. The rest of the things that the United States launched were words, and we're not used to that, but we're still standing strong. So I'd really appreciate your insights to take back to my president, who's also standing up against China.
So it is absolutely the case that all the bad guys, and I would include the Venezuelans, the North Koreans, Syrians perhaps, alongside the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese Communist Party as the folks that we have the responsibility to deter. And I must say, what the current president of the Philippines has done has been bold and brave. The fights at the shoal are stunning. People talk about them being small, right? These are small skirmishes. These are deeply part of the strategic undertaking of Xi Jinping. He is probing and testing everywhere. I would have been in it's pre-pandemic, 2019, when the Chinese tried to shut down a Vietnamese drilling rig that was in Vietnamese economic zone inside their waterways, uncontested space, that clearly Vietnamese. All we did, we simply sent 2 Coast Guard vessels, American Coast Guard vessels, and we dropped them in the water and circled the rig a couple times, and the Chinese went away. Everybody can say, "Gosh, you just got lucky." It's possible. I think they understood, like we were signaling to them very clearly and privately communicating, like, stop, right? We didn't. I'll say one of our failures was actually in Asia. We did pretty good work in the Philippines and the South China Sea, probably not enough. But probably my single biggest failure was that we didn't keep Hong Kong free. I don't know that we could have preserved it. By the way, the Brits didn't do any better than we did. It was a collective failure. I don't know we could have kept it free forever. I suppose that might have been a bridge too far. But I'll bet we could have gotten another decade if we would have taken a set of actions to your point about timing, we had taken a timely set of actions that would have extended the risk profile for what Xi Jinping did there, the political takeover of Hong Kong and destroying the freedom that had been there. Even inside that Chinese model, it had an awful lot of freedom, and it's now just completely gone. And it breaks my heart that we didn't do better there. I hope that we will in the Philippines, and in Indonesia and Malaysia, and in the Pacific Islands. I hope we will do far better. We collectively, the West, will do far better than we did in Hong Kong. It's a model that Xi Jinping now thinks he can use elsewhere.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring that to an end. Timing is everything. Has been one of the themes of this conversation, and that's true also of RUSI events. Before thanking Mike, I just wanted to make an announcement about the next RUSI members event, which will be on the 19th of June at 1700. It will be a lecture, the annual Seaborn Lecture, given by Professor Michael Broers, who's Professor of Western European History at the University of Oxford, and he's going to be exploring the history and culture of the Napoleonic Wars. So a rather different topic, but a very interesting one.
May I have 30 seconds just quickly?
Of course you can.
You should know that my wife jokes, like, you speak to groups and they all walk out and they pop a Xanax or go to the bar, right? Or sometimes both, which is really bad. We're going to win. Have confidence. We always do. we're going to prevail. You ask, can we do both of these things? But this doesn't need to unravel in the way people feel like it's unraveling today. We watch what's happening in the Middle East and in Gaza, and we feel like, I think the American people, and certainly if they're watching CNN, they think it's unraveling, right? We know how to put it back together. We know we know the sinews that connect, right? It's our deep understanding of human dignity. It's our understanding of basic property rights and how you treat people. It's about sovereign borders. It's about faith. Not just my faith, Christian faith, but people of faith and religious freedom, the capacity to worship in the way people want. When we return to those basic normative ideas, and we're prepared to just say, you know what, we're going to defend them. We're actually going to honor those commitments. We're not just going to talk about them. These aren't about press briefings and fancy cocktail parties. And we spend more time on building out security architecture and less thinking about things at COP29. Right? Think about this. We go sign up for destroying the American energy infrastructure, and the Chinese Communist Party builds another coal plant while we're signing the document. I mean, if you care about climate, if you actually think carbon is bad, whatever you like, that's not a policy that delivers against the Western idea of reciprocity and demanding that other nations conform to these set of rules. We know how to do it. And I am long the West. I'm deeply long America. I think if you have money to invest, you should invest it in the United States. The next place you should go is into Ukraine. But it won't be true if we just spend all of our time fretting and not reminding the world that we have lifted billions of people out of poverty. And that when I was a young soldier, I left Germany in October of 1989 after 3 years patrolling the then East German border. The little barbed wire fence between the Czech and East German border came down a couple weeks after I left. Vehicles only drove one way when that fence came down. We should remind ourselves, why is that? We seem to have lost faith in the goodness of what it is that we collectively bring to the world. Don't lose that. Don't lose that with don't let your children forget that. Make sure that they understand that there are forces for good, and they will prevail so long as we're prepared to suffer the burden of delivering against them, of honoring them, because the benefit to us, this is the flip side of the cost and benefit, the benefits to the United States of America about providing resources to Ukraine far exceed $61 billion. And I don't mean this just in the monetary sense. It's much deeper than that. We're going to win. We're going to prevail. It's because folks like you are going to go out there and make it so, have confidence, and when we do, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will be the ones who are on the ash heap of history. And our children and grandchildren will get to live in a world that looks much more like the one that we all want than the one that they are seeking. And so thanks for coming and spending just a few minutes with me today. And
thank you very much indeed. That was great.